Solidarity, Solidarność. It's a word we all use, especially in Poland. In fact, it was in Poland where I came to understand what solidarity meant, not only with the movement, but with the music that accompanied. In fact, I can still recall a few verses. W czasach, gdy się narozrywał, pisze być o rzecz największą. It's better I don't sing anymore. But if you're Polish, you know that song. Or if you don't, you should. And if you're not Polish, find a Polish friend to sing it to you and talk to you about it. But clearly the spirit of solidarity that was so inspired in 1980 is not the same spirit of solidarity that we need in 2020. We need a new kind of solidarity, both more reflexive and more transformational than what we saw. But it was true. In 1980-81, that solidarity movement, Solidarność, was reflexive and transformational. After all, it laid the foundations for communism's end in Europe. That's transformational. And it was reflexive, too. It was a remarkably diverse movement. People of different inclinations, different orientations were all together in that. And they even could recognize the Polishness, the humanity of those who would oppress them. Solidarność in 1980-81 was quite profound for its reflexivity and its transformative capacity. But I don't know if it's that easy to try to take principles in which a national movement is organized and turn them into a more global approach. I have to say, though, I admire terrifically the team that Michał assembled in order to think about Solidarność krok po kroku, step by step. He and his team identified 6 principles to think about how to move that. It begins with recognizing reality, seeking the good, working on yourself, serving others, striving for agreement, and forgiveness and truth. Indeed, it is this book that led me to invite Michał and his colleagues to Brown University's Watson Institute, so we can think more clearly about how to globalize solidarity. What I found profound in their work was the importance of thinking not only about the collective mobilization, but the personal transformations that are involved in realizing a solidarity like that. But it's not just personal recognition. It's also a question of the knowledge, cultural transformations that enable people to recognize reality, to see evil, and to find the good that is possible. We would want to think about how that can cross the world, but that's not easy. We know, after all, that it's much easier to realize solidarity within a nation, especially when that nation is facing an external threat. Patriotism is, after all, a kind of solidarity. The tomb of the unknown soldier is a great symbol of that solidarity, especially because it highlights the humility of that anonymous sacrifice and the extent of which people should imagine that sacrifice to be. But that kind of humility in national solidarities is a little too rare. It's often appropriated by others who wish to declare their right to define the nation, alongside the rules that allow you to be recognized as fully of the nation. This is sociologically understandable, especially in these times. the complex problems we are facing makes it a lot easier to try to identify enemies and to assure the fearful that they will be protected. After all, consider how authoritarians are labeling LGBTQ people as enemies, migrants as enemies, and racial minorities as enemies. This is not just in one country. It is happening increasingly across the world. But there are ways to try to think past this. After all, the European Union was constructed in a way to try to get beyond the idea of a solidarity defended in opposition to enemies, but rather a solidarity of mutuality. It did build on national imaginaries, though. It created a common currency, an anthem, a set of institutions, policies, and practices that were designed to foster a more European identification. It even focused more on glorious futures rather than radiant pasts to inspire loyalty. But it has also, of course, succumbed to this very fateful projection of enemies. Brexit is a good example, where instead of Europeans being allies, they became a threat. But don't just think about Brexit. Think about COVID-19. That global pandemic should have inspired a global response. After all, it threatens all human life, regardless of citizenship, race, class, sexual orientation. But it is new, and it eludes an easy answer. A global commitment to finding a vaccine that would be universally available would have been a pretty smart response. But so too is the response of ending international travel. That should have happened much earlier. And while I am pained that the European Union now excludes Americans from coming to its shores, I get it. I embrace that. That's a kind of solidarity. But I do miss my Polish friends. It's interesting to think about how staying home, whether staying within your nation or staying within your own home during a crisis, within your society, is itself an act of solidarity, but it's not easily seen. We normally think of solidarity as being very public, but solidarity can also be a very private expression, especially in these times. After all, staying home, wearing masks, is a kind of sacrifice. Not quite so great as the unknown soldier, but it is a sacrifice. But it is private. There are others who are sacrificing far more. I think of healthcare workers in particular, who are risking their lives daily in order to protect those who are most vulnerable. Even those we call in America essential workers are now being celebrated for their own dedication to the well-being of others, their risk of their own lives in order to provide for our daily needs. But these people have not been celebrated before. These are often people in America who have been marginalized by richer and whiter folks. Perhaps as a consequence of this very contradiction, those who are essential have been marginalized in the past. We are seeing the development in the United States of a new movement that is reflexive and is transformational. In fact, I wonder if we might think about the comparisons between Solidarity in 1980-81 in Poland and Black Lives Matter right now in the United States. Black Lives Matter was created to respond to the killings of black men and women by police officers here in the United States. But it was reborn after the video recorded and grisly murder of George Floyd. It is a first step, I might say, in Michał Łuczewski et al.'s framework to face the reality of our country. But this is a reality that black people have known, but most white people and their institutions have historically denied it. And it's not just in America. This movement for racial justice is resonating variously across the world, especially in those places where colonialism has not been acknowledged by the ruling classes and their institutions. But like Solidarność, it inspires certain principles with critical questions that travel. When we declare us, about whom do we speak? Black Lives Matter has by now enjoyed more supporters on the streets of America than any other social movement in American history. In that participation, the movement has declared that the us of America has been too white, its monuments too racist, its inclusions too selective. It's not just black folks either. Indigenous peoples have been recognized in ways now that they haven't before. Even treaties that were once considered sacrosanct are being reconsidered, and certainly racist names adorning our sports teams are being changed. Of course, not every nation has to atone for the expropriation of indigenous peoples and the exploitation of black slave labor and colonial territories. And we know horrors of empire are not only committed against people of color. Black Lives Matter has resonated in Poland, but it doesn't only matter for those with African ancestries. The question of who is us can shake us all, especially when we think about the marginalized communities in our midst. The Roma, most obviously in Poland, but also migrants and refugees with whom Poland, Europe, the United States, and many people now struggle to figure how to be just, how to be decent. They so easily become them in the rhetoric of those who find enemies everywhere. Here, then, moves the sociological question about globalizing solidarity, with which I conclude. Are there symbols, practices, policies, or even institutions that can move a global solidarity? The EU's experience would suggest not so much. But I think the EU's experience is an illustration of how we can think about the problem. The EU is a compromise of principled solidarities between a Europe of nations and a union of Europeans. So let me ask, what if pre-existing political identifications were not the basis of our solidarity? What if a question of invitation, of inclusion, were the basis of our solidarity? What if, in order to face reality, we didn't ask the most powerful of our community, but those most at risk in our existing order, to tell us about the reality we need to see? Sounds like a naive question, right? Wrong. Nobody in America could have imagined 7 years ago that Black Lives Matter would become the greatest social movement America has ever seen. It might be because it captures the spirit of solidarity Michał and his team invited us to consider. It faces evil with a love and compassion hard to believe possible from a people so brutally oppressed. Cornel West, the American philosopher and theologian, says it best. The distinctive benchmark of black music is a soulful kenosis, the courageous and compassionate styles of genuine self-emptying that give all one is and all one has to empower, to enable, and to ennoble others. In this metaphoric way, the great black musicians and black freedom fighters are the truth, in that they embody and enact a radical love by freely giving all they are and have to inspire and encourage others. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak and the condition of being the truth is to transform your suffering with great creativity and compassion into forms and deeds that empower others to do likewise in their own ways. So what kind of radical love might we conjure to save the world? Who exemplifies that kind of self-emptying that empowers and ennobles others? The humility of the unknown soldier has it half right. We should embrace those who show us how to serve others without expectations of adoration and return. But I would prefer that we could find people living in the world today, acting in the world today, ennobling people in the world today to be our symbol, to be our point of unification, to be our point of inspiration. Black Lives Matter, proszę Państwa, is that reflexive and transformational solidarity that I am seeking. It's not quite so global as it might be, but that is going to take the work not only of Black Lives Matter, but of those around the world who can see in their example the spirit of solidarity we need in 2020. Dziękuję bardzo. Na razie.